I think there's really three things that make it great. Number one, the speed to innovate quickly, and number two, flexibility to do things that government missions really require you to do quickly and respond to. And then third, unleash the creativity. I think that there's a lot of smart people in government, and open source allows them to be more creative, to couple up in a community with other people, get inspired by other ideas, and actually create something. Many times, I think the rest of the country doesn't think of government people as creative, and I think open source really empowers government people to be even more creative and do things unique with the great data that we have in government. Two that came to mind are NASA's initial work on OpenStack coupled up with Rackspace, I think was one of the really great innovative things. And I think that took some key leadership from NASA. And in doing so, when NASA was ready to kind of exit that initial work that they put in, they kind of handed it off to a community that began to flourish. And the OpenStack community has really empowered Rackspace to be to take on additional competition. So in a market for cloud computing, they can now compete with Amazon and Google and others. And so by government really giving some initial funding and energy and really innovation into an open source project, and empowered somebody like Rackspace to build on that, have a community that flourishes, and then be even more competitive, which ultimately drives down costs for everyone in the market. And I think that's a great example. The second example that I think is really great too is what the intelligence community did with Accumulo, and which is essentially a database and the way that the intelligence community wanted to use it was to secure specific fields in a database because they had security needs that the rest of the community, database community, didn't really think were that important. And so by open sourcing it and then sharing what they had worked on, we now have a Accumulo, which empowers a really secure database architecture in a way that the rest of the open source community had not innovated on. So I think by some unique partnerships and the unique mission that the government has, whether it's the intelligence community or civilian agencies or DoD, you really have the power to create something great and share it and then let it go flourish in the open market. I think that there's kind of two. One would be, I think that there's some push, and I think this is probably the less sustainable pattern for open source, that it's going to reduce costs, that it's going to be some kind of cost reduction strategy, and by using open source software will reduce the cost of enterprise licensing and other kinds of software. I think that in the short term that may be true, but it's not really a sustainable model. I think the economics will shift, and then you'll be stuck, and I think in the long run that may not work out. But I think that if it's done with the intent of empowering, creating, innovating, and then ultimately all those things are kind of forms of leadership, I think that what you have is it's going to lead to a successful ecosystem, a way that creativity is unleashed. People look at government as doing something leading and really providing a service that's really useful to citizens. I think that you get jobs out of that because people feel like they can contribute. People feel like they can get data that the government has and apply their own ideas, apply their own energies to it, and create a business, create something new. And I think that really is empowering not only for people, but for state governments, local governments, and ultimately for the federal government. And I think one of the examples I'd like to use on that is there's the software that Arista makes it took a few years to build, but it's a Linux-based network operating system, the first of its kind. Now, by coupling that with the ability to put an open source, essentially a Linux-based network operating system out there, it allows new business models. For instance, software-defined networking. So software-defined networking is somewhat hot because Nicira got acquired by VMware for over $1 billion. But there's other companies like Big Switch. So we partner closely with Big Switch, and it allows a new model for operating large networks. So by Arista giving us an open source or a Linux-based network operating system, it allows Big Switch or other companies to control networking devices in a way that was not possible in the past. And this kind of creates new models, it creates more efficient network architectures, and I think that ultimately drives down costs for people too. I think it kind of goes back to my second answer, which is don't expect that open source will save you costs. In the short term, it may, but I think that really unleashing the power of open source goes back to leading, goes back to empowering people. It goes back to, as one of our intelligence community customers says, if you give somebody a Linux operating system and you couple that with a good engineer, a talented engineer, there's nothing that you can't do. And I think that government's ability to hire and retain that good engineering talent, or if they're not going to hire it, then at least to reward it appropriately, if that's a contractor or whomever it may be, unleash the power of really good, talented people with a very flexible software architecture and operating system, you're going to get results that you never really even planned on. They're going to vastly exceed what you expected.